If we look closely enough, we're probably used to finding a green lacewing here in the garden, at least the adult anyway. And being nocturnal, it's not always easy to find them in the morning. But what about the rest of their life stage? Because at this point, for the most part, they are focusing on nectar and honeydew, but their larva stage is what we really are interested in as gardeners. So today we're going to explore the life cycle of the lacewing and see why it's so great to have in your garden, and a few tips on how to encourage this incredibly beneficial predator. So of course, one of the first things to look for is finding eggs. And you're more than likely going to find the adult before you find the eggs. But there's a very good chance you have seen these. You just didn't know what you were looking at. And they are smaller than a grain of rice, very delicate on the top of a strand of silk, just a tiny hair of one. Predominantly they are green, if we're talking about the green lacewing. And in this case it's white, which means it more than likely is already hatched. But if we can zoom in, or zoom back, we are talking about an incredibly small, delicate little egg. So in case you've been wondering what those are that you've found on your leaves, and you will find them almost anywhere, whether it's your furniture, a fence, a leaf, the top of a leaf, the bottom of a leaf, they will lay eggs anywhere and everywhere that they feel there's enough food for them. So once you've seen these, there's a very good chance you have some larvae hanging around, and those are truly what you want to find, and that is really what is helping in our garden to deal with various pests. So let's go see if we can find any. Brief detour as we head over to find one of the larvae wandering around. So this is an example of more of a greenish color egg, and this therefore would still be in its encasement. And so if you find this coloring, more than likely it hasn't emerged yet. So still have more coming here in the garden. Anyway, let's go look for the larva. As you can see with the footage I shot earlier, they are extremely tiny when the larva emerges from the egg, which makes sense given the size of the egg. And they are smaller than your pinky nail. And they are they are already anxious to look for food, find aphids, other soft-bodied insects, and they'll spend the next 2 to 3 weeks growing, maturing, and continuing to look very prehistoric, alligator, alien, basically nothing like you would expect for what eventually becomes the winged adult. So when you find this in your garden, very much be excited. It's taking care of a lot of the pests, probably comparable to the ladybug in terms of how much it's feasting on aphids. From this stage, it's going to get bigger and to the point of finally deciding to spin a silken cocoon. And we have, I think, a few examples, and we'll go look, see if we can find them, or I have some previous footage that I'll show. So let's go see if we can find where they were earlier. Well, here we have a cocoon of a empty cocoon of a lacewing. And I think I still have another one that's around here that hasn't emerged yet. But you can see there's a huge difference between this and a spider. There is a more spherical shape to this. The lid comes off, as it were. And the silk is more delicate. Spider tends to have a much more mesh, and it's more sticky. This also is a little firmer. So there is definitely a difference. You can notice it. I'll see if I can put up some footage showing the difference between a spider and the lacewing. So you can kind of compare. But really you should leave both of them alone. But if you're just wondering what you're looking at, hopefully you can tell the difference. But let's go see if we can still see the other one that's might be in its cocoon. And I'll also show some footage of one that was moving around in the cocoon. So you can see here that it has, so it's just a sphere, and it tries to create a little space between leaves or just on a leaf, but tries to tuck away and have some very delicate silk, and you'll notice dark mass on the inside, and as it's getting closer to emerging, it will get darker, it will turn more green, and there's a very good chance you'll even see it turning into dark spots that will be the eyes. I managed to capture some footage a while back of one of these cocoons that I had to move because it was on shade cloth that I was removing, and seeing it turn and rotate. Here, have the footage up. So if you look closely, you can see it moving around, and the two dark spots that you could probably, or at least one dark spot you can see, and that's the eye. So in less than a week, maybe up to a week, sometimes they can end up overwintering in this encasement. But eventually they do emerge, and being generally nocturnal, a lot of times their emerging happens at night or extremely early in the morning. So it is a rare treat to witness, and I managed to time things just right. to actually see this and experience it, which we're going to look at right now because I still remember it and it was still pretty amazing. Okay, well, I know it's a bit weird lighting because it's later in the evening, so having to make do, but here it is. The lacewing larva has emerged as a full adult and is now trying to do a secondary, well, I call it a secondary molt. So it emerges obviously from a very small cocoon and is now expanding and trying to form and get into the adult that we're used to seeing. So you can see, obviously, the eyes and the wings are all collapsed onto the side of the body there, and it's slowly getting larger and expanding. So an absolutely amazing thing that I've never witnessed in person, and I hope the rest of you enjoy this. So after looking at all the different stages of a lacewing, how do we encourage them to not just show up, but to stay in our space? And probably the biggest one really comes down to not using chemicals. I know sometimes that can be hard, and I'm not going to suggest never using them. There can be situations where you might need to, but those should be extremely rare, and as best as possible moving away from that, because we want to think about the consequences. We are trying to create a space that allows not just the adult, but the larva to exist. And if we are spraying chemicals, even if they're organic, we are not just killing the pests, which are also becoming resistant to a lot of the chemicals we're trying to use, but we ultimately are killing off a lot of the beneficials. Because you think of aphids, for example, they're feeding on the plant, and then you have the lacewing or others that are feeding on the aphids. And in the case of the lacewing larva, they're easily going to consume hundreds of aphids in that 2 to 3 week period of growth. So how easily those chemicals build up into the body and cause damage that we may not be able to figure out at the moment. So that, to me, is first and foremost, to get away from that as best as possible and allow nature to sort things out. The second thing is food, and not just for the adult, but for the larva. We often talk about planting alyssum, dill, yarrow, and these are great plants if you want to be growing them, absolutely. But to attract the adults, I have found in my space, just having something blooming has worked. So I've had desert willow and globe mallow and other native wild flowers, and that has been more than enough. But you can't just focus on the adults. The larva stage also need food. So that means the aphids, the other soft-bodied insects of spider mites and thrips, that when you have both and you're making sure things are blooming at different stages, so you have staggered planting to allow blooming to happen throughout the season, then those are really the two main tips I have. And it's not going to be something that happens overnight. I'm not saying there aren't challenges, but eventually you are going to have a space that is thriving. If you haven't already, I would definitely recommend checking out my previous video on what I'm calling the predator trifecta, and we'll see you next time.